Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the night's broadcast of Tap Into the Truth. Hope you are having a fantastic day wherever you are and whatever you may be doing. This is your host, Tim Tapp, coming to you as always, from historical Roane County, Tennessee. Tonight, wanted to do a little bit of talking about a certain upcoming Supreme Court case. Okay, folks, if you haven't done it already, you need to circle April 28th, 2015 on your calendars. That's the day the Supreme Court of the United States is slated to start hearing oral arguments in the Obergefell versus Hodges case. Now, why does this case matter so much to so many people living in the United States? This is the case that will, at least for the foreseeable future, settle the question of same-sex marriage at the federal level. Now, the Supreme Court has heard cases in recent years involving the question of same-sex marriage, but they have carefully and intentionally avoided handing down any rulings on the merit of the constitutionality of same-sex marriage itself, either by ruling based on other merits in the cases or by rejecting cases due to a, quote, lack of standing. This, of course, was done in hopes of avoiding direct ruling on what is a societal hot potato where there is no clear-cut constitutional answer, at least according to some. The hope, of course, was that our society would settle the question without having to have it adjudicated. But the passions on both sides of the question have forced the issue to the highest court in the land. Now, as far as the members of the court are concerned, nothing has changed as far as their desire to issue a ruling on this question. No matter how the case works out, there's absolutely no way for their individual votes not to seem political, and there will be a number of Americans unhappy with the outcome regardless of which way it goes. But there's no dancing away from it this time due to the case itself, because the two issues at the very heart of this case, issue one, does the 14th Amendment require a state to license a marriage between two people of the same sex? And issue number two, does the 14th Amendment require a state to recognize a marriage between two people of the same sex when their marriage was lawfully licensed and performed out of state? So, even if the court decides that it's strictly a state issue and not a federal issue, which the criteria for issuance of marriage license has always been a state right, they have to rule that there is no constitutional protections for those seeking to marry people of the same sex. And while that would be a devastating blow to the LGBT community, it is entirely possible that even some of the more liberal justices might vote that way. Because what most people don't even seem to realize, there is no constitutional right to marriage for anyone. The argument for the federal intervention on behalf of same-sex couples is found in the 14th Amendment, where the Equal Protection Clause is found. The pro-same-sex marriage people claim that once a state has marriage laws established, that the state must then apply those laws equally. Although, there are several people that would say that whether same-sex marriage is legal or same-sex marriage is illegal in a particular state, those states do apply the laws equally, because all people must wed under the same restrictions to be recognized by the state. Now, some people say that's just a cop-out. Some people say that's a bogus argument. But strictly legally speaking, the measure of equal treatment is everyone treated the same per the letter. This is an attempt to try and make sure that it's everyone treating the same under the spirit. But the question is, does the 14th Amendment actually help in this argument? That's where the issues come into play. That's where we have to find out. Now, before you can make that determination, it's important that you know exactly what the 14th Amendment says. And in this particular case, the only part of the 14th Amendment that matters at all is Section 1. So, before we can decide whether or not it is or should be a factor in the argument, let's take a look at it. Amendment 14, Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdictions thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction, here's the tricky part, the equal protection of the laws. Now, that's the whole point of the argument that the so-called progressives are pushing in their attack on the value of one man, one woman marriage definition. Now, as you can see, this amendment was concerned with guaranteeing that former slaves were treated as equal members of our nation. This is focused on protecting their rights to be free, safe, and to hold property. This was obviously one of the Reconstructionist amendments. For those of you who don't know enough about history to understand what I'm talking about when I say that, these are amendments that were added to the Constitution after what we call the Civil War. Really wasn't a civil war. You didn't have two separate groups trying to take control of the same government, which is what the definition of a civil war is. Blah, blah, blah. Not going to go into that at the moment. But the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution were meant to try and guarantee that the nation could be put back together and that everyone, including the former slaves, would be treated as citizens. And that's what this is about. Now, in the context of the Reconstruction, it certainly wouldn't seem to apply to the particular question at hand. But the equal protection of the laws argument has been used to protect minorities from discrimination ever since Reconstruction. And many see this fight as exactly that, protecting a minority from discrimination. So the question that the Supreme Court is going to have to decide is, does that apply? Are they going to stand up and are they going to force every state in the country to accept same-sex marriage? Or are they going to say that there is no merit based on the argument and therefore there is no jurisdiction for the court to rule one way or the other? Or are they going to take it a step further and say that, as it has always been, this is a state issue, take it back to the states? That's what we've got to wait and see. Now, I personally feel that ultimately this has been, and should forever be a state's right, and that the people of each state should decide for themselves. I think that the Supreme Court should rule that there is, in fact, no constitutional right to marry, period, for anyone, and therefore the federal government has no power to interfere with the states' rights to establish their own criteria for recognizing such a union. Now, the framers of the Constitution didn't put anything into the Constitution about marriage because at the time it was only thought of as a religious union, and that the government had no business being involved anyway. And, as far as I can tell, a lot of these folks that lean heavily to the left side of the political spectrum are the ones that are constantly yammering about separation of church and state, although their understanding of that is not what's actually in the Constitution, just FYI. But, you know what, before you just flat out dismiss my thinking on this as you're just a right-winger kind of thing, you've got to understand, and if you've listened to this broadcast before, you've listened to the shows before, you've heard me express my opinion on same-sex marriage. I understand that I am a little more libertarian on this issue than most of my conservative friends. Take a lot of heat on it, for that matter. And while I do understand those fighting for the one-man, one-woman definition, either for religious reasons or the ones that are just in it in an effort to protect our culture, and I don't just understand their arguments and the reason they're standing up, but I applaud them for taking a stand and being heard and presenting their arguments in a respectful fashion. There's that key word you're going to be hearing from me for some time to come now. You've always heard me say use your brain. Now you're going to be hearing me say respectful quite a bit. Now, I tend to agree with the framers, and I see true marriage as a faith union, regardless of what the state recognizes. So the definition of marriage isn't changed no matter what a state decides. In the end, it's up to you to pursue your happiness, and no law or court case or anyone outside of you other than the people in your circle can change that. Still, there's no doubt that there will be anger and outrage, as well as joy and celebration, once this case is over. There will be politicians that will seek to garner your favor. There will be groups that will still try to change your mind, to get you to join their side. But no matter what, millions of people will be waiting and watching. And after all that, this fight will still not be over. So like I said, circle the calendars, April 28th. If you haven't heard about it yet, I promise you will be hearing about it, because folks are already talking about how this could be the end of the religious right, which is a lot of wishful thinking on their part. These are probably the same folks that honestly thought that conservatism was dead before Ronald Reagan came along. I've said my piece, told you what I think about that. I'm going to cover a couple of things. If you missed Sunday's broadcast over at Blog Talk, I'm going to give you a couple of quick hitters from that show as well, because the Supreme Court has made news recently in a couple of other cases, most notably a couple of cases involving Obamacare. Now, as you may or may not know, last year the 7th Circuit Court ruled against Notre Dame University and forced them to pay for contraception insurance despite the school's religious objections to contraceptives. Now, for those of you who don't know, Notre Dame University is a Roman Catholic university. Now, the Supreme Court has vacated that finding and told the lower court to rehear the case. The Supreme Court ruled last year that Hobby Lobby and other corporations could be exempted from certain parts of the Obamacare mandates based on religious objections. I'm sure most of you remember that. So because of that ruling, the Supreme Court has told the lower court to revisit their decision